Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and maybe your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Today's episode is called A Campfire Story, where two friends' lives are forever changed by an evil encounter during a camping trip. Eric and Matt had been best friends since they met on the bus in middle school. Since they lived in the same neighborhood, they spent most of their free time together, watching movies, playing video games, and wandering the neighborhood. However, their favorite activity, especially in the spring and summer months, was exploring the woods behind Eric's house. It was large enough to get lost in, but not so large they ever worried about not finding their way home again. They spent hours playing manhunt, the big kid version of hide-and-seek, shooting their airsoft guns,
Pew, pew.
and building forts along the many tiny creeks that wove through the forest. As they got older, they began taking pup tents and spending the night in a small clearing they'd found, which is what they were doing on a warm Saturday night the summer before their senior year, the night Eric tried to kill Matt. The two boys had spent the day roaming, splashing in the creek and talking. As light receded from the woods and the shadows grew deeper and longer, they pitched their respective tents and started a fire. Eric pulled out hot dogs and Matt produced a bag of Cheetos, which was all they needed for a good meal. They chatted as they ate, trading gossip and stories about their high school classmates. They competed in a burping contest and laughed at the dirty jokes they'd traded a dozen times before.
Ha!
During a lull in the conversation, they heard a noise, faint with distance. They both stopped, tilting their heads to listen. It sounded like laughter or screaming.
Ah!
"Who is that?" Matt asked. "You think it's the Curtises?" Referring to a pair of brothers from a different neighborhood they'd met in the woods a few times. "Maybe, but it sounds like they're over on the other side," Eric answered with a shrug. They resumed their meal in silence as the weight of the night settled around them and the forest became still. The boys lounged near the fire, staring at the flames or up at the few pinpoints of stars visible through the canopy of trees. Suddenly, they both sat up straighter, looking around uneasily. There was a crashing noise through the underbrush.
Crash!
And the definite sound of laughing. It was nearer than before, and as they listened, they thought they heard a panicked wheezing sound. Without thinking, Eric grabbed a bottle of water and doused the fire. He and Matt stood together, tensed. There was a little ambient light from a half moon, so they could see the occasional shadow and light patch through the trees. They both jumped as a large form leaped into a small clearing about 50 yards away. In the dim moonlight, they could see it was, in fact, Jerry Curtis, the older of the two brothers they'd met before. Curtis apparently couldn't see them in the darkness, and they heard him wheezing a frenzied, "Please, please, please, please," as he lunged to the right toward the bushes at the other side of the clearing. Matt raised his arm and stepped forward, intending to call out, but Eric pulled him back just as another figure, which turned out to be the younger Curtis brother, Tommy, trotted easily into the same clearing, humming tunelessly, and then loped into the same bushes. It looked like he was carrying a machete with dark splotches on it. Matt and Eric stood silently, listening as the crashing grew fainter. After a few minutes of silence, they relaxed a bit, but both let out startled yelps as an ear-splitting scream pierced the night. They exchanged a low-grade telepathic conversation common to best friends and turned to begin packing their things, having decided to spend the rest of the night in the safety of Eric's garage. However, they soon stopped, looking around uneasily. The forest had grown menacingly quiet. There was no noise from the nearby highway, no crickets or any other typical nighttime sounds. Even the water in the stream was silent. They both stood up, looking around warily. They'd chosen not to use any light to avoid attention, so they squinted into the trees around the camp, trying to distinguish the various shadows. Matt was the first to see it, a dark shape with glowing red eyes watching them from a branch about 50 yards away. Without taking his eyes off it, he smacked Eric's shoulder and pointed. The other boy looked and gasped. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Matt said. It was too big to be a bird, although as they watched, it unfurled a pair of membranous wings, flapped once, and folded them around its body again. "What is that?" Matt whispered again. Eric didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to the glowing embers embedded in the complete and utter darkness of the form. As he watched, the red eyes seemed to grow, widening until they filled his vision. Then he saw the images. Like riffling through a stack of photographs, the images in his mind were separate but related, flitting through his consciousness. Images of blood, dismemberment, human sacrifice, dark rituals, and torn flesh all clamored in his mind. At first, he recoiled in horror at the images. Then a sense of peace overtook him as the images swirled in his head. After a moment, they stopped. Eric blinked, and the figure was still there, unmoving. But he still felt that sense of calm. He realized Matt was babbling and turned to look at his friend. "It's not right. I don't know what that is, but it's not right. And it's so cold. Cold. Do you feel it, man?" Matt turned to look at him, eyes wide with fright. In addition to the calm, Eric felt a curious sense of detachment. He no longer recognized Matt as his friend. In fact, as he watched the other boy, vaguely remembered that they had been connected in some way, but now Matt was just a gibbering, whiny bag of meat. Like what he imagined a rabbit would sound like if it could talk. The image of a talking rabbit was funny, and he barked a short laugh. "Woof!" Matt stopped talking and grabbed his arm. Snickering, Eric pulled his arm away, bent to his backpack, and started rooting around. Thinking that Eric was grabbing a flashlight, Matt followed suit, pulling his own light and hoisting his pack onto his shoulders. He took a step on the path leading towards Eric's house when he felt a sudden sharp pain between his shoulder blades and was slammed to the ground. He shouted in pain and surprise,
"Owie!"
rolling over to see Eric standing there looking down at him. Matt fumbled his light on and shone it into Eric's face. "Man, what the—" He stopped suddenly when he saw Eric's face. Eric wasn't there. His body was there, and it looked like him, but whatever was looking at him was not Eric. His eyes were cold and devoid of emotion, and his expression was one of curiosity and amusement. Eric knitted his brow in concentration and said, "I'm going to need that back." Then Matt's breath whooshed out as Eric kicked him in the belly. Matt curled up, gasping for breath and wincing at the strange, sharp pain in his back. He felt a tug, and the pain subsided to a dull throb. That's when he saw Eric straighten up, holding his Bowie camping knife in his hand. At 12 inches, it was a wicked-looking thing that Eric had ordered off the internet as a gag. They'd both laughed about it, and it had become kind of a running joke through their regular campouts. But now, it looked huge and terrifying in Eric's hand, and he wasn't laughing as he stared down at Matt. "Got stuck in your tent," Eric said conversationally, nodding towards Matt's backpack. Matt pulled himself up to a sitting position and kept the light pointed at Eric as he crab-walked away, feet scrabbling for purchase in the soft gravel. Eric leaned over, resting his hands on his knees as he studied Matt. "Because this should have gone right through you." He held the knife up, and the light from the flashlight glittered across its edges. He peered closer at the weapon, noticing a smear of red on the tip. "Ah, but it got you a little bit, didn't it?" He smirked, but his eyes were still devoid of emotion. Matt managed to get his feet under him and jumped up. "Dude, what the fuck?" His eyes alternated between Eric's face and the knife. What the fuck is wrong with you? Eric straightened and cocked his head, the little smirk still lingering. Ah, the little rabbit speaks. Matt realized the voice was all wrong, too. It was slightly deeper and had an odd sing-song quality about it. Man, let's get out of here. Come on. He pointed at the knife. Just put down the knife and let's go. Eric glanced at the knife in his hand and then took a step toward Matt, thrusting the blade towards his chest. Adrenaline pumping, Matt twitched out of the way and the knife snagged his shirt as it passed through where his heart had been. Fuck you, dude, Matt muttered. Taking advantage of Eric's outstretched arm, he punched him in the side of the head, sending Eric sprawling. But almost as quickly as he fell, he bounced back up,
Boing.
still holding the knife. Rabbit wants to fight. He smirked again and strode toward Matt. Over Eric's shoulder, Matt glimpsed the black figure. This time it was sitting on a lower tree branch about 30 feet away. He could see that it had sharp horns. When Matt's flashlight beam played over it, it was like it absorbed all the light and remained pitch black, revealing no visible curves, features, lines, edges. It was like a silhouette cut from the fabric of darkness, except, of course, for those glowing eyes. In the brief second that Matt stared at the eyes, they started to get bigger, and he started to feel something. But Eric's approaching form quickly captured his full attention. In that moment, Mark knew this wasn't a weird fight or a dream or a prank. Eric was simply going to kill him with that stupid knife while that thing, whatever it was, watched. Eric was the bigger of the boys, but Matt had always been the fastest runner, which he decided to put to good use as he spun and sprinted into the trees. He could hear the bigger boy's heavy footsteps pounding on the ground behind him as he dodged and ducked the rocks, bushes, and trees he knew so well. He heard a swishing sound and staggered as Eric's knife whipped at his backpack. The staggering cost Matt his precious lead and enabled Eric to catch up, grabbing Matt's shoulder and spinning him around. However, Matt simply threw himself backwards away from Eric and the knife. He landed on a slope overlooking the creek, and his momentum allowed him a sort of somersault, winding up back on his feet. Meanwhile, Eric had overcompensated and fell face first, sliding down the hill on his belly. Matt leaped over the other boy and ran back the way they'd come, this time angling for the trail that led to Eric's house. He soon reached the trail and, fueled by fear, ran faster than he'd ever had before. As he ran, he heard mocking laughter that was clear but sounded far away. Suddenly, he became aware of a crashing in the brush nearby.
Crash.
And was astonished to see Eric burst onto the trail, slamming into Matt and pushing him into a tree.
Oof.
The smaller boy bounced off.
Doink.
His momentum carried him a few steps further before his feet tangled and he fell to the ground again. Panting and heaving, Matt pushed himself up, trying to get his feet under him. He looked at Eric striding towards him and was amazed to see the other boy wasn't even breathing hard. Exhausted, Matt lurched to his feet and stumbled backward on rubbery legs away from Eric. He backed into something solid and realized he was at the wooden privacy fence that lined Eric's backyard. They usually just climbed the fence, but Matt knew he'd never get over in time. He sagged into feet as Eric closed the distance. As he got closer, Eric brought the knife up, but once he got within arm's reach, he stopped abruptly. His expression was one of confusion. He looked around, bewildered, and then saw Matt leaning against the fence, eyeing him warily. What's going on, man? What happened? He noticed the knife in his hands and dropped it quickly. Oh, God, was that real? He reached out to Matt. Are you okay? Having regained his breath, Matt quickly stooped and picked up the knife, staying just out of arm's reach from Eric. What the fuck, man? You were trying to kill me. Matt pointed at Eric. You literally tried to stab me. Then he felt the dull pain and what felt like a trickle of blood between his shoulder blades. Wait, you did stab me, motherfucker. Eric held out his hands, pleading. Man, I'm so sorry. Honestly, I don't know what was going on. I thought it was all a dream or something. I would never. Matt was pacing back and forth, his anger swelling. You stabbed me in the back. You literally stabbed me in the back. Then you chased me. I thought I was going to die. Anger gave way to fury, and he stepped toward Eric, punctuating his words with the knife. You chased me like I was prey, like I was a rabbit or something, and I never want to feel that way again. He stepped back, the anger dissipating almost as quickly as it appeared. He heard a gurgling, wheezing noise and looked down to see Eric gasping and clutching at numerous wounds on his chest. Blood poured from his mouth and perforated chest, and Matt shrieked at the blood-coated knife in his hands. He dropped it and backed up as Eric's wheezes slowed and finally stopped, his chest collapsing with a last prolonged exhale. Matt took a tentative step toward his best friend, reaching toward him uncertainly. Tears filled his eyes and streamed down his cheeks as he looked at Eric's lifeless body. He found himself on his knees, holding Eric's hand and crying.
Why?
Then, after a moment, he cocked his head to listen. From somewhere in the woods, he heard crashing through the underbrush.
Crash!
Accompanied by the same laughter he'd heard before. He remembered the older Curtis brother and how scared he'd been. At first, he thought it was terrifying, but now it just seemed kind of funny. Jerry Curtis had looked a little like, well, a scared rabbit. He smirked and then chuckled. Matt sniffed and smeared the wetness from his face with the heel of his hand, then reached over to pick up his friend's knife, wiping it on Eric's pants a couple of times to clean off the excess blood and dirt. Time to hunt, he said as he stood and, humming softly, jogged down the path into the woods and never looked back.
The end.
The end. Okay, so that was episode 8.
Episode 8, yep.
I know it took us long enough to get it out, that's for sure.
So I expect another one written by next week.
Yeah, you're not the boss of me.
You think that,
I do it
but
all.
I am.
I do it all. So, what did you think of this story, Precious?
Well, but he killed his friend. I didn't like that.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that either.
But you wrote it.
Well, during the creative process, sometimes things happen that you don't really expect to happen. You got to kind of go with it as the creator.
Ooh, creative process.
I don't know why you got to be so antagonistic.
Was I the inspiration for this story?
It's getting close to being that way.
Maybe the ending?
Maybe the ending, yeah. So, where do you get the motivation and the inspiration for your sound effects?
It's just like magic. They just appear to me.
Kind of like, I don't know, a creative process?
Kind of like a creative process.
Uh-huh. Creative process. All right, well, it's obvious we're not going to be super constructive with this commentary, so...
But we're delightful and entertaining.
That's what we keep telling people, but we still don't have nearly as many friends as we'd like.
Or fans, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, speaking of fans, if you know anybody who wants to be simultaneously entertained and possibly annoyed for about half an hour, turn them on to our podcast. We'd love to have more listeners. In the meantime, I think we'll probably end it here. We hope you enjoyed listening to our story as much as we enjoyed telling it. We're pretty sure you have more friends than we do, so be sure to tell them all about us and click to follow our podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at dark.n.precious or follow us on Facebook at Dark&Precious Storytime. Feel free to leave us any feedback or if you have any story suggestions. Who knows? You might just hear your story idea come to life in the next episode of Dark&Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.